Well, good afternoon and welcome to the second Transforum of this year's Refugee Week research series. My name is Maria Casaniti and I'm the manager of the Transcultural Mental Health Centre and New South Wales Health Statewide Service. The Centre's focus is to work with health and related professionals and a range of organisations to promote and enhance the mental health and wellbeing of culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And today is one example of how we do this via, reviewing and looking and hearing from our researchers in the field. I begin with acknowledging the Darug people as the traditional owners and ongoing custodians of the land. I pay my respects to the Darug elders past and present and extend that respect to First Nations people that may be with us here today. As we are also online, I acknowledge the many other traditional countries and language groups that everyone is meeting from. Our centre celebrates and embraces diversity. So from the world's oldest continuous culture of our first Australians to the cultures of our newest arrivals from across the world. We acknowledge people with lived experiences as migrants or refugees and their families with us today, and the courageous journeys of many generations of Australians who have made Australia what it is today. The Transcultural Mental Health Centre acknowledges the individual and collective contributions of those with varied lived and living experiences related to mental ill health, psychological distress, and those who have loved and cared for them. During Refugee Week, we acknowledge the strength and resilience of refugees, those seeking asylum and displaced people, in their search for a life free from fear and persecution. We recognise the unique experience of their journey and we support their arrival and settlement and wholehearted participation in Australia. I would like to express a warm welcome to attendees today coming from many mental health and related social services across our beautiful state of New South Wales, and appreciate that some of you also joined us yesterday. Thank you for all coming today to hear Professor Belinda Liddell, and a big thank you, of course, to Professor Liddell for sharing her research with us today. World Refugee Day is this Friday, and in Australia, the Refugee Council's theme for Refugee Week is Finding Freedom, Diversity and Community. The theme reminds us of the profound favourable impact that a supportive community can have on those with refugee experiences. It's a call to consider not only the concept of freedom, but also the deeper meaning of belonging and inclusion. For countless refugees, true freedom encompasses much more than physical safety. It's about reclaiming one's sense of self and mental well-being in a safe and supportive environment. New South Wales Refugee Health Plan 2022-2027 recognises that meeting the health needs of people from refugee backgrounds is critical to successful settlement and integration. As professionals in mental health and in health services, we are acutely aware that the journey for refugees extends well beyond resettlement. The shadows of trauma and loss can linger, but so too does the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit, strength and growth. This year, our centre is proud to feature researchers sharing valuable insights throughout Refugee Week. And today, as we recognise and welcome Professor Liddell, who will present on her current research. The aim of the research series, as stated yesterday, is to equip health professionals with knowledge and tools to better support refugee communities, specifically learning about current research that can help improve culturally responsive, person-centred approaches to support the mental health and well-being of individuals with refugees and asylum seeker experiences. And secondly, learning how best to empower individuals with refugee and asylum seeker experiences with strategies to connect with communities, self-care and health literacy. A reminder that we will be recording today's session as a learning resource, and it will be available on the Transcultural Mental Health website for future reference, along with yesterday's session and tomorrow's session as well. Be aware that we will be discussing some difficult issues, so please be mindful of how this might impact and take care of yourself. Now let's start today with an individual story celebrating Refugee Week. Today we have Zara Ashfaq, who speaks of her refugee journey. The video that we are going to share is approximately 3 minutes long. Thank you. The voice of the refugee is especially important in the current context, where refugee communities globally and within Australia continue to face discrimination, social exclusion, and systemic barriers, all of which can significantly impact mental health and well-being. So such stories of hope keep us on track. At the same time, we recognise that individuals at the intersection of cultural diversity and at different stages of their migration and refugee journey experience unique and layered challenges. These personal experiences matter, and as practitioners, it is our responsibility to listen, respond with cultural humility, and provide inclusive, affirming care for the individual in front of us within the larger social context that they reside in. At this point, let me now introduce you to Emmeline, a clinical psychologist and mental health consultant at the Transcultural Mental Health Centre. She works in the Refugee Mental Health Program. Over to you, Emmeline. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. And for those who are coming along for the first time, happy Refugee Week and welcome back to those who joined us yesterday. As Maria mentioned, I'm part of the TMHC statewide refugee mental health program, and our work spans both community and clinical spaces, collaborating to create a strong, structured approach to supporting the mental health of new and emerging communities. And it's through this program that we're able to host today's Transforum. Today's video story of Zara Badri's yesterday, for those that were here, and tomorrow Tetiana's story are all taken from a longer piece available on our website, crafted by our community team colleague Samantha Eade. The shared stories of Badri, Zara, Tetiana, and Banan are a great testament to the resilience behind every statistic. Their journeys speak not just of survival, but of adaptation, healing, and the courage to build new beginnings. We continue to share and learn from these inspiring narratives. So today, Professor Belinda Liddell will talk to us about neurobiological approaches to understanding refugee trauma and post-migration stress. Professor Liddell is the Daphne Keats Chair in Cross-Cultural Psychology in the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Newcastle, an adjunct professor in the School of Psychology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and the Deputy Director of Refugee Trauma and Recovery Program. When you're ready, Professor Liddell, thank you.
Hello, it's very nice to be here. Thank you very much to Emmeline and Maria for inviting me to take part today. And it's very nice to see some familiar names amongst the people here today. So it's going to be wonderful to share some of the findings from some studies we've been doing for many years. I'm just checking you can see the slides okay? Yes, okay, great. So as Emmeline said, I'm going to be talking about some neuroimaging studies that we've been conducting over several years with refugee communities in Sydney. And the intention of these studies was to really understand the impact of refugee experiences on the brain to try to inform practice and policy. So first of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands where I now live and work in Newcastle, so the people of the Wabagal Nation. And pay my respects to elders past and present. That's a photo of about half an hour walk from my house, and it's a very beautiful place. I also acknowledge the Bedegal, the Darug, and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which much of this work was conducted. I'd also like to acknowledge from the outset the contribution of thousands of refugees and asylum seekers and former refugees who have participated in the research studies that I'll be showing you today. And particularly those who participated in the functional neuroimaging studies. It takes a particular amount of courage and resilience to participate in research and to give of one's own experiences to try to benefit others. So I'd really like to acknowledge the people who took part in these studies. So there are unprecedented numbers of forcibly displaced people worldwide, as we know. This is from the global report, a trends report from UNHCR that was published about a few days ago. And so responding to the protection, health and mental health needs is a global priority. A research seeking to understand the specific impacts of refugee experiences is urgently required to inform this response. So when we think about refugee experiences, we typically group them within 3 phases. Excuse me, and I do have a cough that's kind of from the flu a few weeks ago, so I apologise if I keep coughing throughout the talk. So the first phase is really termed the pre-migration phase, and it's really characterised by significant amounts of trauma exposure. And this could be not just single event trauma, but exposure to multiple events over prolonged periods of time, and there's accumulation of trauma experiences. Many of the traumatic events are interpersonal. They might involve human rights violations, including torture, and it also doesn't happen to an individual. The trauma happens to families and to the collective community. The second phase is the peri-migration phase, and this is marked by the displacement. And this is forcible. It's often taking dangerous and risky journeys to seek safety. And on the other side, refugees are typically faced with long-term temporary accommodation and having to navigate immigration policies of destination countries that are more often designed to deter than to welcome. And then the third phase is post-migration phase, which is characterized by significant ongoing uncertainty and stress regarding the future. And that could include visa insecurity, exposure to daily stresses, and acculturation hurdles. And refugees are also, across all of these three phases, experience significant amounts of loss. And this is something that we're really interested in trying to understand how to better prepare and support people in these situations. And this might include traumatic loss of loved ones, ongoing and prolonged family separation, the experience of missing family, having the loss of social networks and connections and community and culture. There's also a loss of status that occurs through the displacement process, and sometimes the loss of a life's work, including businesses, farms, and so forth. So given these experiences, it's hardly surprising that the rates of psychological disorders such as PTSD and depression are around 3 times higher in refugee populations compared to the general population. That's the statistics there, and the Australian population is in the orange, and refugees, and this is aggregated data from across many different studies in meta-analyses, show it's around 1 in 3 people experience depression and 1 in 3 people experience PTSD. Until relatively recently, the field has really focused on the impact of these past traumas on increasing risk for mental health challenges, but there is growing evidence of the importance of the post-migration conditions, including the impacts of daily stresses and how they impact on psychological outcomes and even exacerbate the impact of past traumatic experiences on mental health. So while we know there are these relationships, there's been less research into the mechanisms that drive the psychological outcomes and what factors might determine poorer mental health versus resilience amongst refugee populations. And so that's what I've been focusing on, and we've been focusing on in our group, around trying to identify mechanism. And today I'll be talking more about the neural mechanisms, the brain processes that might underlie the impact of refugee experiences. So in our myself, my colleague my colleague Angela Nicholson and myself started the Refugee Trauma Recovery Program at UNSW about 12 years ago to support the conduct of refugee clinical and mental health research to better understand mechanisms that drive the impact of refugee experiences on mental health in order to inform policy and practice. Now I've moved to the University of Newcastle, so we're extending that work to the up here in Newcastle, and I'm building my new lab here in my new role as the Daphne Keats Chair in Cross-Cultural Psychology. This is some of the team based at UNSW. This is from a couple of years ago. We need an updated photo. I often get asked, why can't research with other trauma-exposed populations just be applied to refugees? Why do we need to study and to conduct research with refugee communities specifically? Well, there are some, of course, learnings that we can take from other trauma-exposed populations, but there are important reasons why we need to look at research with refugees. So the first one is that refugee experiences is that it might affect neurobiological and physical systems in a sort of a unique way. This might include the impacts of stress, trauma, deprivation, and we know that brain sciences can actually inform the evidence base to develop treatment innovation. We know that also that research from other populations might not generalize because of the unique constellation of refugees' experiences, the cumulative nature of the trauma exposure, and the present adverse experiences that often characterize the post-migration environment to impact on mental health in unique ways. Refugees are also from diverse cultural backgrounds, and we know that cultural factors influence post-traumatic psychological functioning and probably very profoundly underlie mechanisms in significant ways. We also know that many of the gold standard treatments for trauma, including clinician-administered and low-intensity interventions, appear to be less effective in refugees in general, and we don't really know why that's the case. Refugees might have been exposed to significant trauma, including torture and other cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment and punishment. And they have a right to effective and evidence-based rehabilitation under international law. And we need to conduct research with to build an empirical scientific evidence base, so that we can to inform policy, that we can build practices that protect and support refugees. So I'll be talking about some of the neuroimaging work that we've been doing, and we conducted this research over a number of years. 4 years when we with over 150 participants with a refugee background. For this project, we collaborated very strongly and closely with STARTS, and particularly I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of all of the counsellors and mental health workers and others, community workers at STARTS, and particularly Jorge Aroche, Mariana Askovich, Mariana Coelho, Jamal Duarte and Dominica Doring, who were more involved in the study. And also my colleagues Richard Bryant, Jim Marley, Preetha Das, Kim Felmingham, and also some others from RTRP who contributed. For this study, we had participants were referred from STARTS or by other community or refugee services around us in Sydney. And then they participated in a 2-session interview. The first session was focused on the informed consent process, to trying to ensure that everybody who was consenting fully understood what they were consenting for. And then we did a clinical interview to obtain information around current mental health symptoms, stresses, and big trauma histories. And then participants were provided with transport support to attend an MRI scan at Royal North Shore Hospital. And during the scan, that they participated in a number of different studies, including some psychological experimental studies that are typically used to understand emotional and cognitive and social mechanisms. So today I'm going to be sharing 5 studies from this project. Now, these are they're complex studies, and so I'll try to focus on the key findings. If there's anything specific you'd like me to go into detail about, please do ask me questions or contact me afterwards. I'm very happy to, of course, share the papers with you directly, so do feel free to email me if you'd like me to share the paper. So the first study I'm going to be showing you today is looking at the brain processes of correlates of PTSD, trauma and post-migration stress in refugee population. So we know that there's been significant advances in the empirical understanding of the brain and the psychological mechanisms that underpin PTSD. The state of the science shows that there's core brain networks and regions that are implicated in the pathophysiology of PTSD, including at the top there, emotion dysregulation, executive functioning, and elevated threat and salience detection processes. What we don't know is, do these models of this neural model of PTSD, is it relevant to refugee experiences? Majority of studies that have been done have been in clinical populations who might have experienced single traumatic events, and from the diversity of experiences that refugees have had. So we want to see whether or not they're adequate to account for these experiences. So first of all, we're going to be focusing on fears processing neurocircuitry as part of the core systems of the brain that are disrupted in PTSD. Research shows that the more severe the PTSD symptoms are amongst trauma survivors, the more dysregulated the fear processing networks of the brain are. We also know that trauma exposure is associated with specific disruptions within these types of networks as well, including parts of the prefrontal cortex and precuneus, which are really important for information processing and down-regulating emotional reactions. And also we're really interested in what's the role of post-migration stress on neurocircuitry activation in response to fear stimuli amongst refugees. Does it elevate some of the dysregulation issues that we often see within PTSD? Is it a significant form of stress in its own right in terms of how it influences the brain function? And so to do this, we looked at the influence of all of these factors on how refugee participants responded to fear faces in the scanner. And so this is quite a common task to evoke emotion responses in the brain. And so participants would look at a series of faces, some of them displaying fearful expressions and some of them displaying neutral expressions. And it's a well-evidenced task to engage fear systems of the brain. Our participants were 85 refugees, former refugees living in Sydney, with a mean age of around 38 years, and around 2/3 of the sample were male compared to female. And we had participants from a range of countries of origin, but the largest cohort were from Iran, followed by Iraq, and then other countries were Syria, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, and so forth. So we had 40% of the sample met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD as defined by DSM-5. So it's a very, and people had exposure to around, on average, 11 different traumatic event types. So it was a highly trauma exposed and a significant amounts of PTSD amongst the cohort. So what we looked at was the correlations between these different influences on brain reactivity to the fear faces. The first thing that we found was very interesting. We did not find that PTSD symptom severity correlated with any parts of the brain in response to fear faces amongst the sample, when also controlling for trauma and post-migration stress. Now, this is really different to what you would normally observe in other clinical populations with PTSD. However, what we did find is that there were significant correlations in the brain with how much trauma the refugees had experienced. So there was a positive correlation with more trauma exposure, with greater activation within the insula, what's called the pregenual ACC, which is anterior cingulate, this ventral part of the frontal part of the brain, and also the posterior cingulate cortex. These parts of the brain are really important in fear processing, form part of the salience network that's typically hyperactive in PTSD, but we're seeing it in relation to how much trauma people have been exposed to as opposed to PTSD symptom severity. And while we found that there was more activation within these regions, we also found that these regions were less connected with other parts of the brain. So less connected with the inferior frontal gyrus, which is an important part of the executive control networks of the brain in the frontal cortex. We also looked at the correlations of post-migration stress, so how much stress people were reporting within the post-migration environment, including things like immigration worries, difficulties accessing work, worries about separated family and feeling isolated, and so forth. And we found there was a significant correlation between the degree of post-migration stress and activity within a part of the brain called the fusiform face area. This brain region is particularly geared to processing face visual stimuli, and they're suggesting that there might be some sort of hypersensitivity to the fear faces amongst the sample in relation to how much post-migration stress they were experiencing. We also found that there was a stronger connectivity between the fusiform face area and other parts of the brain, including the temporal region shown here on the left and the right cerebellum. And so this increased sensitivity in response to fear faces, contingent on how much post-migration stress was being experienced, might have some implications for how refugee is settling and adapting to life in Australia, including around how someone might be engaging socially and interpersonally as well. So one of the questions that emerged from this was, does trauma type matter? We know that trauma load seems to have a great impact on how the brain responds to fear faces, but does it matter what type of trauma? Our particular study was really designed, the grant that we received to fund this project was designed to understand the impact of torture on the brain. And so we were really interested in how that torture affected brain function. And the reason why is because torture is so prevalent amongst refugee populations. Estimates are that it's around 1 in 5 refugees are survivors of torture, and it's the single biggest predictor of PTSD amongst conflict-affected populations. Clinical presentations might be distinguished by a loss of control and sense of self amongst torture survivors, this disrupted interpersonal processing and emotion dysregulation. And so we wanted to this provides a sort of testable framework for us to look at some of these functions in terms of brain activation and understand the impact of torture on these functions. Our study was designed to try to overcome some of the limitations of the past research, which really intermixed experience of torture with other types of traumatic event experiences. And even though we can't necessarily separate those out, we recruited a cohort of torture survivors and were able to compare them to survivors of other types of trauma, but that weren't torture survivors. Okay, so this was the first study that I'll show you. So this particular one, we compared survivors of torture to non-torture survivors, and we focused just on male survivors because our sampling was majority male survivors. We had 31 survivors of torture compared to 27 controls for the people who did not experience torture. And we asked them to look at faces again. So we asked them to look at the fear faces again and neutral faces, but also we included happy faces. So looking at more positive emotional signals. What was really interesting about these findings is that we found that the torture survivors showed reduced activation within a part of the brain called the ventral striatum, which is here in the blue in the brain image on the right there. That part of the ventral striatum is a very critical part. It's central to our reward circuitry of our brain. Now, the torture survivors in our study showed less activation in response to happy fear faces in the ventral striatum, but this was correlated with how severe their PTSD symptoms were. So there was the higher amounts of deactivation within the ventral striatum to the happy faces with higher amounts of PTSD symptoms. We also found some similarities between the processing of fear and happy faces. So torture survivors showed less activation with the hippocampus in response to fear faces and to happy faces, in relation to how much trauma they had been exposed to, the level of trauma overall, the counts that they had been experiencing. So more torture resulted in less hippocampal activation in response to fear and happy faces for torture survivors. So we also found that for fear faces, there was some changes in connectivity between the hippocampus and other parts of the brain as well, for the torture survivors specifically. So this study, the take-home message from this particular study was that torture seems to impact both threat and reward processing, but it was dependent on PTSD symptomatology, so how severe the PTSD symptoms were for reward processing, and overall trauma experiences and trauma exposure. So how that sense of cumulative trauma and multiple traumatic events is a really important impact on how the brain processes emotional images. We wanted to also look at what might happen if we looked outside of the emotional space and looking at cognitive control processes. We know that these are particularly from clinical research, particularly disrupted in torture survivors. And so we tested this in a go, no go response inhibition task. In this task, participants were looked at letters, X and Ks, that appeared on the screen in front of them. And they pressed a button to the X, and they didn't press the button to the K. And so they, and that the K is the no-go. So that's what's the behavioral inhibition is being tested with in response to the no-go image, the K. And so it's able to, this task is a really a well-validated task to look at response inhibition processes. For this task, we had 33 torture survivors and 44 non-torture survivors take part. First of all, we took behavioural measures, so how accurate people were in responding to the letters and the different conditions, and response times. And there was no differences between torture survivors and non-torture survivors in either accuracy or response time. However, we did find that in terms of the brain activation patterns, torture survivors showed less connectivity in response inhibition, attention and motor networks. So you can see here on the top images here, this is the left precuneus and the posterior default mode network, which is an important part of our attention networks. And we also found here on the second level, reduced activation within the superior temporal gyrus or in the auditory motor network. And we also found reduced connectivity between these networks. So reduced connectivity between the dorso-attentional network and the dorso-medial frontal network for torture survivors compared to non-torture survivors. These are all really critical parts of the brain that are responsive to cognitive control, response inhibition, and attentional allocation. We also found that during the no-go trials, and when a participant was successfully inhibiting their behavioral response to the K picture to the no-go trial, that the ventral attention network was less connected in the torture survivor group. Now, that network is very important for responding to salient cues that we see in our environment and suppressing irrelevant information. That is, inhibiting our response to things that we don't need to pay attention to. And so this suggests that torture survivors, if they're using this network less, that they might be using other strategies or neural strategies to engage in this task, because we didn't see the behavioral differences. We also found that there was this association between torture exposure and PTSD symptoms, but particularly dysphoria symptoms, so symptoms of withdrawal, emotional numbing, and so forth, was moderated by this reduced connectivity in the go-no-go task. And so it looks like the brain regions that are responsible for cognitive control and response inhibition, if they're less connected with each other, that plays a potential role in the maintenance of PTSD symptoms, particularly dysphoria symptoms. And it really does highlight potential for cognitive control and inhibition functioning as a target for intervention if we can through various treatment approaches. Okay, so I'm now going to turn in the last few minutes to trying to understand show you some studies that we looked at particular types of post-migration stress. Doesn't matter what's going on in terms of post-migration stress for refugees. We know that the level of post-migration stress affects how fear faces are processed, and with indicating hypersensitivity, but might there be a particular impact of particular stresses, such as visa insecurity? This particular study was motivated by some of our research that was looking at the impact of visa insecurity on mental health, where we found that, and this is of course with a lot of other studies, that insecure visa and temporary visa security was associated with elevated rates of PTSD and elevated rates of depression compared to people who had refugees with secure visas. So we wanted to think, well, how does visa insecurity impact on how the brain functions and how the networks of the brain functions to support our general day-to-day lives? There are different intrinsic networks of the brain, and they each have sort of different functions. And one that we were particularly interested in is called the default mode network. This is the brain networks that's most active when we're just at rest and we're not particularly engaging in any task. And we know it underpins how we think of ourselves and self-referential processes. And it's quite important in sort of emerging models of uncertainty. These models suggest that difficult changes in the default mode network might be related to how we think about ourselves in the future when we're in situations of extreme uncertainty. It also underpins things such as imagining certain events or mind wandering and so forth. There are other networks that could be involved in how a person might experience visa insecurity. The salience network is hyperactive to threat and novelty and stress. Now we know it's involved in PTSD in general. We also know the central executive network can be disrupted in times of uncertainty and it involves things like difficulties concentrating, difficult challenges with holding things in working memory and so forth. There may be difficult changes in how the frontal parts of the brain regulate the self and also our affective states. And we also thought there might be something to do with how the somatomotor networks of the brain manage changes in the body following uncertainty. And so we looked at all of these different networks in this particular study. So in this study, we had participants do what's called a resting state fMRI. So instead of doing any particular task, participants were asked just to keep their eyes open, looking at a fixation cross, but they could think about whatever they wanted to for 5 minutes. In this particular study, we had participants 47 who had insecure visa holder. So either they had a temporary protection visa, a bridging visa, or on community detention at the time, or they were secure visa holders, so either an Australian citizen or held a permanent protection visa. This is a very small slide, which you probably can't see, but this is more to indicate the sort of the breadth of the post-migration stresses that the secure visa holders and insecure visa holders were experiencing. So the insecure visa holders are shown in the blue, and you can see here that they're significantly higher than the holders of secure visas. So there were significant differences in terms of fear of being sent back to country of origin, not being able to find work, separation from family, and so forth. We used a data-driven approach to our analysis, which means we didn't impose any specific expectations on what might be, what networks would be engaged during the resting state task. So we look at what's happening actually within the sample and derive networks based on activations within the sample itself. So we identified 25 discrete networks within the entire sample, and 10 of these were within our area networks of interest that I explained before: the default mode network, central executive network, salience network, etc. And this is the 10 here. You can see them all there. And what we found was that there was we looked at whether or not there are group differences within each of these networks between the secure visa holders and the insecure visa holders. So we found that the insecure visa group showed what we call low levels of spectral power, particularly in this network, the anterior ventral default mode network, compared to the secure visa group. This indicates that there's decreased metabolic activity in this network in the insecure visa holders compared to the secure visa holders. We also found in spatial mapping that there was a particular part of the brain, the superior frontal gyrus within the posterior default mode network, that was specifically less connected in the insecure visa holders compared to the secure visa holders. So we only found differences in the default mode network between the two groups. Then we looked at connectivity between networks, and we found that there was a positive connectivity between two parts of the default mode network in the secure visa holder group. So between the anterior dorsomedial default mode network and the posterior default mode network, because that's how the frontal part of the brain and the back part of the brain communicate with each other. And this is what we should see. We should see that there is positive connectivity between these parts of the brain to support healthy self-representation and functioning. But in the insecure group, we found a different pattern. We found negative connectivity. What this means is that as the frontal part of the default mode network is activated, the back part of the default mode network, the posterior part, is underactive. And so there's what we call anti-synchronization between these two parts of the brain. And even more so, we found that the degree of this anti-synchronization was correlated with self-reported fear of deportation amongst the group. So why the default mode network? So this network is really important for self-referential processing and making representations about the self and the future. And so it does suggest a line that disruption that we saw specifically within this network aligns with this model of uncertainty that is emerging, and really speaks to the disruption to self-determination and sense of self that really marks the experience of living with the insecure visa. We also know that the findings could also reflect in elevated levels of stress that the insecure visa holders were reporting as well. And so it could be the uncertainty, it could be the stress, but it's the combination of the two of them that are really influencing how these midline aspects of the default mode network are communicating with one another. And in the final study, which I'll take 1 minute to try to explain, we were interested in the role of family separation in terms of impacting on brain activation. So we know that family separation is associated with elevated symptoms of depression and PTSD compared to when not being separated from family. And some of the qualitative research that we've done and just to acknowledge the Australian Red Cross, who we're working very closely with on some of these projects, is that it's highlighting there's 3 key components to why family separation is so impactful. The first is this ongoing insecurity because of family members living in states of unrest and conflict, that there's that sense of perpetual threat and insecurity. There's interpersonal changes because of the loss of and disruptions to social systems and loss of social support and absence of attachment figures. And there's personal changes to self-identity and reduced self-determination. In this particular imaging study, we were interested in the role of attachment systems and how that might either assist with coping with stress or be interfered with in some way in refugees with PTSD and with family separation. So the way we looked at this, we did an experimental paradigm where we primed attachment, and which causes the activation, this attachment system to activate. And so we showed people images of either attachment images, so pictures of mothers and children, fathers and children, families, grandparents with children, and so forth, or compared to non-attachment cues, which is just a person smiling at the camera but without attachment relationship being depicted. And after that, we showed either emotional or neutral cues, and then asked people to give a rating of how they felt following that cue. What we found was we compared refugees with PTSD to those without PTSD. And we looked at how much grief they reported in relation to experiencing separation from family. And what we found was that the refugees with PTSD who were experiencing more grief related to separated family, they showed increased emotion dysregulation in the brain during attachment priming in response to both the threat and neutral cues. So this is seen in terms of heightened activation within the amygdala and lower activation within the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus as well. This suggests that attachment systems, which normally work to downregulate threat reactivity and help respond to stress coping, is less effective in doing so when refugees are experiencing elevated grief related to separation from family. And so it's sort of neurobiological evidence that family separation can diminish intrinsic stress coping mechanisms of attachment in the brain. So we're learning that cumulative trauma and post-migration stress impact on fear neurocircuitry, irrespective of PTSD symptoms in refugees, that torture reduces fear and reward activations in the brain, and as well as response inhibition and control attention networks. Visa insecurity is associated with this asynchronous activation within the default mode network, which is reflecting that limbo status and disruptions to self-determination. And that separation grief interferes with intrinsic or attachment coping systems in the brain in refugees with PTSD. There are some limitations to our studies, mainly in relation to the participants. We have a mixture of treatment-seeking community sample participants, and we don't have something that comes up with reviewers for our papers is that we don't know if these relationships are specific to refugees. We don't have a non-control a control group who aren't refugees, who might be experiencing substantial stresses as well, and so that's something to consider. And most of our torture survivors are male as well, just due to the nature of the exposure to torture, and so there is some biases there as well. I'm just going to skip ahead because I'm just realizing what the time is, and I just want to go to the last slide in relation to the implications. Obviously, there's a lot of data here, and if I'm totally honest, I'm still making sense of what these studies are telling us in terms of implications for treatment and potentially for practice and policy. So these are my 4 key takeaways in terms of implications. The first is that neural models of trauma really need to be adjusted to account for the cumulative nature of refugee trauma and the impact of ongoing contextual stress. So, not surprisingly, this is a feature of some of the sort of conversations in terms of the traumatic stress field generally, that we can't just look at trauma in isolation and treat it like it's a past event from the past. Its impact continues, and often trauma survivors are dealing with significant traumatic experiences, and stressful experiences in their day-to-day lives post-trauma. And so it's also very important that addressing structural stresses could have a positive impact on both mental health and brain functioning of refugees. We can see that specific trauma events like torture appear to have a long-term impact on brain functional architecture and task-related connectivity in the brain. So this is critical that screening for torture exposure is a central step in primary care provision and mental health care for refugees. Treatments for torture and other traumatic events could typically focus on reducing fear symptoms, but there could also be a focus on elevating reward processing, responding to positive emotional and interpersonal signals that could be of benefit. And finally, interventions that facilitate the development of connection to self and to others could be really helpful in terms of strengthening attentional control processes, heightening self-representation, and bringing back online attachment processes, even when refugees are dealing with very significant stresses like visa insecurity and separation from family. And overall, and exactly what Maria started off saying, is that the safety, security, and connection is so fundamental to trauma recovery for refugees. And finally, just like to acknowledge the enormous amount of people who have been involved in many of these studies over the last 10 years. And that's the end. Sorry, Emmeline, I know there wasn't much time for questions.
It's all good. That's all. It's all fine. Thank you for persevering as well with the cough, and it didn't take away from what you were talking about.
Sorry about that.
That's fine. And look, I guess it like I said, it doesn't take away from what you were sharing today with the coughing fits and things, and that those final words of your slide around safety, security, and connection is fundamental to trauma recovery for refugees is a real great reminder for us today. And it might be that we might have to take some of those questions that we got and maybe ask you afterwards. I don't just put you on the spot here, but look, I guess give you a bit of a breather and drink. Look, the exploration, I think, of refugee mental health through this neurobiological lens, really showing how trauma and post-migration stress can reshape the brain. I don't think, even though I'm with a clinical psychology background, and went through all of those studies remember those studies from undergrad and postgrad, but just I think thinking about that in this current space is really helps to sort of understand those effects that, then can help us create more compassionate, trauma-informed care. And just seeing how, healing can emerge through that time, safety, and community support, reminding us that rebuilding lives also means rebuilding systems when you're talking about visas and things, and grounding that in trust and belonging. So I might get you to stop sharing screen just really briefly. Sure. So I'm just trying to think what kind of, because I know that clinical practical application of what you've just spoken about is probably the most important thing for everyone to sort of think, how do we then put those things that you mentioned in terms of attachment, in terms of cognitions, how it affects our attachment, emotion dysregulation, grief. Is there any one thing where we could start with all the studies that you had? I know you just said, I'm not sure about how I would apply this stuff, but
I think I think everyone who works with refugees will know that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, that everyone comes in to a service with such a unique array of difficulties. I think that and that's sort of why we kind of cast the net quite widely in our studies. We wanted to first really just see whether or not there were differences to compare to what the evidence base tells us around how trauma generally affects the brain, and if there's differences for refugees. So I think that's the first starting point, that yes, there are, and it might help with people who are seeking treatment to use some of this in terms of even psychoeducation to try and demystify for clients what they're experiencing, that they might be experiencing difficulties in regulating their behaviors, or coping with their separated families, or understanding how they can see themselves in the future if they don't have a secure visa. And this might help them understand, well, that's why I'm feeling that way. It's just basic psychoeducation sort of materials that can really demystify and help people to navigate that understanding, and providing sort of objective evidence for what they're going through could be a good point.
Yeah, I think that's actually, I didn't even think of it that way, but I think that is a really good point, just to give that psychoeducation as a starting point for them to really understand what's happening to them. So that's great. Thank you so much. Sorry, it's now 1 o'clock. So look, thank you all for coming today, and especially Professor Liddell. And we've got also our evaluation on screen. If you can kind of complete that, otherwise we'll send an email later today, because I know that we also had our refugee mental health program website on there. If you have And as Professor Liddell mentioned, you can get in touch with her about the papers as well if you wanted to learn a bit more. And we will have a recording, as mentioned, on our website. If you have any other questions that come up following today's webinar, please feel free to get in touch. And we hope you've also registered for our final webinar on Thursday, where Dr. Philippa Specker will be presenting on, and kind of a great continuation from Professor Liddell, on the role of emotion regulation in refugee mental health. In any case, I hope we've managed to honour both the scientific evidence and the personal experiences, the hard data alongside the individual stories. Happy Refugee Week, everyone, and wishing you a lovely day ahead.
Thank you, everyone.